Please welcome Elizabeth Cobbs.
Good morning. I'm going to turn this way because otherwise I'm going to hit it. I have big gestures and it'll be going, wow! That'll be the excitement. I want to thank you so much for being here. I thought on Friday morning at 8:30 a.m. for sure it was going to be me and 8 other people. And I particularly touched because we're really all in this together. I know we've talked a lot at the conference about the divisions in America right now, right? And I personally believe that one of the things that can bring us together more powerfully than anything else is our history. I was researching this book on Harriet Tubman, and I had the pleasure of visiting her gravesite in New York. And I was standing there, and I drive a Subaru, and I have a Hillary Clinton sticker on the back from several years ago. Okay, that's just letting you know that. And I was standing there with a man who had on a red Make America Great MAGA hat. And we were both looking at Harriet Tubman's grave, and he said to me, "Isn't it a shame that Americans don't know more about Harriet Tubman?" And I said, yeah, it really is. And I think when I started to write this book, one of the reasons was because it was projected that she would be on the $20 bill. And I thought, if this woman, who most of us only know what we can write on the back of a cocktail napkin about, if she's going to be the woman who leads American women onto our currency for the first time in our nation's history, then we really all need to know more about her. So I'm with that gentleman. And I agree with him that Harriet Tubman is somebody who can bring us together. So I'm going to be doing something a little weird, I usually do, because I'm a historian, but I'm also a novelist. And so this particular book is a novel, and you might think, why in the world would a historian write fiction as well? And so I'm going to tell you about that, but I'm going to do more of my historian role today, because I do really want you to understand this story. And then we'll talk a little bit about the fiction. Okay, I'll sneak that in. So we begin with a historical mystery. Okay. Harriet Tubman. On June 1st, 1863, 2 U.S. gunships, American gunships, crept up a river in South Carolina. It was around midnight. They were edging towards Confederate rifle pits, which were stationed at the mouth of the river. Now, they're going upriver, this quiet, what they call a blackwater river, and it's studded with underwater mines. 10 miles away is an army of 2,000 Confederate veterans. There are sentinels posted along it. There's been artillery as well on the edges of the river, because that's how the South defended its shores, with torpedoes. They were called torpedoes, with underwater mines and with cannons surrounding them. The men on board this ship, this isn't the very ship, but this is one much like it, because it was dark. Hey, how could I have gotten a picture of it, right? It was midnight. Anyway, they're creeping into what's called enemy territory, America's own enemy territory. And on board is a man who marched with John Brown in Bleeding, Kansas, but who survived, and there are 300 uniformed black men. Now, this is the first major expedition of African-American soldiers against a defended Confederate position in American history. It precedes the famous Glory movie, the Fort Wagner assault, by a month or more. So they're trying to save a country, half of which wants them in chains, and half of which is struggling to set them free. These are men fighting for that country. So now here's the mystery. Why did they set out that night? Why did they pick that target? Why were they confident? Why did they at least think that they had a fighting chance to get in, to get 25 miles upriver, to burn 5 plantations to the ground, to liberate hundreds of people, to destroy Confederate positions, and to get away without being slaughtered? Who was guiding them? Could it have been Harriet Tubman? Now, this is not Harriet Tubman, so I'm a little advanced of myself here. But there's a problem when we look at women in history, all right? Most people in history are not very well documented. Okay, you and I, we're not going to be well documented, let's face it, except for Facebook. Anybody has the patience to go through that someday. So the thing is that I know this partly because my preceding book was a nonfiction book called The Hello Girls, America's First Women Soldiers. And these women, who you see here, were, as you see, being reviewed by General John Pershing, who was the commanding general of American troops in World War I. Now, these women stood in the front row of reviewing parades at the end of the war. We have video recently released by the National Archives, which shows thousands of men in lines and Pershing running up to the top to tell them that the armistice has been declared, blah, blah, blah. In the front row of that line were these women, a group of these women, who went to France and served at risk of their lives in army uniforms, wearing dog tags, under threat of court-martial if they misbehaved. And they came home and the army said, "Who are you?" The army didn't see them, and that's because of something which we call, in a way, well, sexism. No. It's what we call selective perception. Your brain only sees the things you expect to see. So if something happens that's kind of off to the side of your vision, or it's something you don't think fits, you don't see it. So to me, this is relevant because I found that these particular women, it took them 60 years for the army to finally see them. They came home in 1919, some of them came home in 1920, and it took them 60 years to get their discharge papers and their victory medals. Now, the same thing was true of Harriet Tubman. You probably don't know that she received a military pension. It took her 30 years to get it. Men who served under her got their pensions immediately. They had to fight for them too because they were black, but they got them. It took Harriet Tubman 30 years. So the historical mystery here is partly who led them that night, and of course, I think I know the answer, and I'm going to be telling you the answer, but also who was Harriet Tubman. Sometimes when people say, who was Harriet Tubman, you might say, oh, she was leader on the Underground Railroad. If you're particularly well educated, you might say, oh, I think she was a nurse in the Civil War. Maybe she was a washerwoman, actually, in the Civil War. So was Harriet Tubman a washerwoman and a nurse in the Civil War? Is that how she really should be remembered? Or was she, in fact, a scout, a spy, and, of course, a veteran? A status for which she had to fight, just like the women of World War I had to fight. These wonderful, beautiful, heroic veterans who unite us all, who are our great-grandmothers, our great-aunts in the case of World War I, etc. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to sketch the scene. I want you to know a little bit more, get us all up on dry ground, which is a good metaphor in the Sea Islands because there's not a lot of dry ground, and ask you to draw your own conclusions about this, and then I would like to tell you a little bit about the book. And I'm hoping to bring back, through the medium of fiction, these events. And as I say, I alternate between fiction and nonfiction. And one reason for that is because fiction lights the dark corners of evidence. As historians, we can't make up anything. We can only tell you what we actually truly know. Otherwise, we're jerks. That's where fake news comes from. We only tell you what we truly do know. We can't say it was raining unless we know it was raining, for example. And in this case, what we know about Harriet Tubman in this is somewhat sketchy because the Army records are sketchy. It's nothing she did. And also because of this phenomenon of selective perception, which was something upon which Harriet Tubman relied as a spy. She didn't want to be seen, right? How do you slide through a room and not be seen? So I'd like to tell you a little bit about the war itself. So the war begins in April of 1861. It begins because of this event, the bombing of Fort Sumter, and that's the sort of where the rubber meets the road, and the South says you can't have our fort, which of course is a federal fort. The Federals will not leave, and so it's bombarded, launching this great war, which is the biggest war in American history, by far, bar none. When the bombing is over, the former federal fort is more or less in ruins, but it's still held by the South for 4 years. So what happens then, of course, is the war breaks out, and the question is, how in the world can the North prevail? You have to remember the South is bigger than all of Europe. All of Europe. Now, all of the Europeans absolutely know that the North will fail. And they know it's going to happen. Because even if you could win against an enemy this big, you could never keep it afterwards. Oh my gosh. You know how hard it is to just keep some small territory. So it's bigger than all of Europe. And so they have, and the Europeans knowing this, that was my first novel about Charles Francis Adams on the diplomacy of the American Civil War. The Europeans are supplying the South. Now, people sometimes say, well, how does the South, why does the North win? Why does the South lose? Actually, the question is, why does the South able to go on for 4 years? They're able to go on for 4 years in this defense of slavery, which is how the war was phrased always by the South, that this is to defend our institution. Read the Southern documents, and that'll be very clear, is that they can go on because they're supplied. So this leads to the big military problem of the United States, which is how to keep these blockade runners. You remember Rhett Butler. Surely you remember Rhett Butler. So how to keep Rhett Butler and everybody else away from the southern coast. So General Winfield Scott drew what was called Scott's Great Snake, and was, of course, a cartoon made of it. But the idea was to put a stranglehold, a blockade around the southern coast. Now, the southern coast, as you can see, is pretty doggone long. And it's not only long, but it's indented in a bazillion places. So there's thousands of miles of coastline. So they know, though, if they're going to have ships there to prevent this inevitable thing from happening, which is inevitably the South will win, they have to do what they can. In fact, Charles Francis Adams, son of John Quincy Adams, grandson of John Adams, said, we don't really think we're going to win here, but we just have to try. So one of the things they have to do is they have to find at least some place that they can refuel their ships in this vast, long, long blockade. Where are they going to get fresh water? Where are they going to get any food? Where are they going to repair the ships when the ships are damaged? As they will be, because they're going to be fired upon by the Confederates. So they have to have something on the southern coastline. They have to find somewhere to occupy that, from the northern point of view, hated, center of the rebellion, which is South Carolina. So they decide to invade the South Carolina Sea Islands, and this map, which is on the inside of the book as well, shows you, you have to focus pretty hard here, but this is a wartime map of the Union. It shows St. Helena Island, Port Royal Island, and the various islands, Hilton Head, that the North invaded. And the North did in November of 1861. This shows a bombardment of Port Royal, South Carolina. Beautiful town, by the way, if you ever get to go to Port Royal. I hope you do. It's just fabulous. Anyway, so Port Royal Island, the Marines storm ashore, of course. They liberate the island, they take over the island, they occupy it in one day, and then they're marooned there for 4 years. Because the war, as we know, goes on a powerfully long time. It is a war of ideas. I'm very aware when I say the South or the North that I'm perpetuating a stereotype. There were Southerners who were loyal to the American cause. There were Northerners who supported slavery. So we have to be careful not to perpetuate any regional stereotypes here. And I point this man, Percival Drayton, who was a native of Charleston, South Carolina, and he was on one of those ships. He captained one of the ships that attacked Port Royal and prevailed. His brother, Thomas Drayton, was the head commander of Confederate troops, the defenders of Port Royal Island. Both Charlestonians, both passionately defended to their cause, to the idea of what is America. Why does Harriet Tubman unite us? Because Harriet Tubman is about what America is about, a land of freedom, a land attempting to be more free all the time. So one of the things that happens is that they accidentally, well, kind of accidentally on purpose, but they do accidentally liberate 10,000 people. This tiny island, 10,000 enslaved people are on this island. Now, I say accidentally because from the northern point of view, now that's the weird thing, the South is fighting passionately for slavery. The North is fighting for the Union. I hesitate like that because it took the North a long time to come out and say, well, no, actually, we are fighting about slavery. Let's go ahead and talk about that. And that's what the Emancipation Proclamation becomes about. And so one consequence of this is that when people were liberated, the North had never asserted, Lincoln had never asserted that he had any right to free anybody, anywhere, anytime. That wasn't the power of the federal government to liberate people in the South. And so they called these people contraband. Now, for you history geeks out there, people like me, that's my one hat, and then there's the other hat. What a contraband means that in time of war, you are legally entitled to take anything that your enemy is going to use against you in the pursuit of the war itself. So that usually means guns and, naval stores and stuff like that. But in this case, people, were the Confederacy's greatest wealth. Their labor was what was going to give the Confederacy the money to prosecute this war. And of course, enslaved people were used to dig trenches and to do all kinds of things, actually, in the conduct of the war itself. So the contraband are freed. And one of the things that does is it presents all these, the great issues of the war. What happens with these people? They are freed, but they are freed as contraband. And so it's a while before anybody figures out exactly how this is going to work. What's that going to mean, their freedom mean? And one of the people who is at the center of my story is General David Hunter. And Hunter, he was an abolitionist. He was the man who came to actually control the island. He decided he wanted to put the black men that he had liberated into uniform. That this was the time to give these men, as men, the right to defend themselves, the right to pick up a gun, the Second Amendment, the right to defend their families and defend themselves. This was caused great scandal in the Congress, et cetera, and at some point Lincoln said, no, you can't do that, but they ultimately prevail and they're able to do that as an emergency wartime measure. And this actually depicts Emancipation Day, January 1st, 1863. Now, personally, I do not know why this is not a national holiday. I mean, we have July 4th, which is wonderful. What a declaration of our independence, a declaration of American freedom. The second Declaration of American Freedom was on January 1st. That's when it took effect, January 1st, 1863. It's our second Independence Day, our second day devoted to liberty in America. So what happens is that these men are allowed to defend themselves. This shows you a picture of the 1st South Carolina Volunteers, as they were called. This is the first official regiment of the U.S. colored troops, as they later came to be known. Now, it's kind of a weird situation because on the one hand, Hunter's being told, please don't, recruit men to do this. He's finally given kind of grudgingly permission. Black men are also grudging, some of them. There is a good amount of volunteers, of course, that come from this island. But you have to understand is that this Emancipation Proclamation is a halfway measure, and it's a wartime measure. It's not a law. It's something the president said one morning. So it's a little weird. And not only is it something the president said one morning, it only frees the people over whom Lincoln has no control. It only frees the slaves who are in states that are in rebellion. Now, states that are not in rebellion, and you may remember there were a couple slave states that did not rebel, did not sign on. They included Maryland, Harriet Tubman's home state. They, Maryland, I just said Maryland, okay, what are the others? Kentucky, et cetera. I'm forgetting the exact ones now. But anyway, Maryland is very critical because this is where Harriet Tubman was from. So this brings us to our heroine, who I do consider the most outstanding female patriot in American history. Now, by the way, I didn't start with that conclusion when I started writing the book. I actually thought, as a historian, it's very important for you to not walk in with a conclusion. You have a hunch, you have a guess, you have a thought, this is why you're doing the book, but you have to really satisfy yourself that the evidence stacks up as you think it actually does. So Harriet Tubman goes to South Carolina when it is occupied. She is sent by David Hunter is talking about this man who's Governor John Andrews of Massachusetts. Now, Governor John Andrews of Massachusetts sends Harriet Tubman south. Well, she's willing to go. But he recommends to the commanding general in the South that he accept the help of Harriet Tubman. Now, if she was a washerwoman and a nurse, I don't think that the governor of the state of Massachusetts would be likely to be, making a big point out of this, sending this woman at government expense to the South. No governor has ever called me a very valuable woman, for example, and with good reason. So why Harriet Tubman? Now you have to understand, and I'm going to tell you a bit more about her, but so you'll know more than you can write on the back of the $20 bill she will eventually be on, we hope. Harriet Tubman was the only person in America in 1861, 1862 who had 11 years' experience going behind enemy lines. She'd been going behind enemy lines ever since she liberated herself in 1849. And she had gone back. We don't know exactly how many times. Now, you might say, well, then we don't know how many, then did it really happen? By the way, we don't know her birth date either, so was she really born? So this is the way history works, is that we simply don't know all the facts. We have to gather facts and draw, as jurors would in a criminal case, the logical conclusion based on the evidence that we do have. So this is one reason, again, to use fiction, to draw out some of the things which we think are plausible, to show them so that we can feel them. By the way, there's an article I love, you might Google at some point, called Your Brain on Fiction. And Your Brain on Fiction shows that when they take MRIs of what's happening in your head when you're reading fiction, it's very different than what's happening in your head when you're reading just a purely factual account. You actually remember it better because it's the part of your brain that stores memories of what you personally experienced, what happened to you. So you're more likely to remember it, and you're more likely to feel it. And it creates a bond of empathy between the reader and the person you're reading about. And that's another reason for me to write about Harriet Tubman through fiction. So she goes south, and there are a variety of abolitionists who do go south. There are many abolitionists who do not go south. Now, she's a woman in her late 30s, early 40s by this point. She's already given so much to this cause. You know, she's risked her life. She is the only conductor on the Underground Railroad that we know of historically who went back as many times as she did, who got out as many people as she did, and who was never caught and never lost a single passenger on the railroad. She's the only one who did this in our history. And we think of her as, well, this woman who did something. And I think it's partly because we just, again, our selective perception of stuff is such that we have a hard time picking out what is important. So part of what I want here to do today is to help you understand why she isn't so important. And then I'm going to ask your help telling somebody else, all right? So we'll multiply this effect. So Frederick Douglass doesn't go. They're about the same age. By the way, they're from the same part of Maryland. We don't know. It's possible they even might have known each other in Maryland. And they certainly knew each other well in the abolitionist movement. Instead, he does what any sensible man does. He sends his young son, who becomes an officer in the U.S. colored troops. So that's what most abolitionists did. But Harriet Tubman did not. She went back, which raises the question of who the heck was Harriet Tubman? What's her personality? How are we to understand what went on in her beating heart? So I start with this. This is the actual runaway notice of Harriet Tubman. Some wonderful family in Maryland found it just a few years ago. I'm not going to ask you to read it, but I'm going to tell you that right in the middle it talks about a woman named Minty, because Minty was her nickname when she was enslaved. Her original name was Araminta. She changed her name to adopt her mother's name, Harriet. Later called herself Moses, as essentially a spy name. Moses meant that they'd always be looking for a man, right? It's also a good name in terms of the biblical metaphors of freedom. And it says that she was aged about 27 at that time, is of chestnut color, fine looking, and about 5 feet high. So one of the things is this tells us that this is a very tiny woman. She's about 5 feet high, which means she's 5 inches shorter than I am. She's very slender. We know this from pictures that like the one I showed you, and I'll show you again in a little bit. She is illiterate. So she has a bounty on her head of tens of thousands of dollars. So the question is, how does this person infiltrate enemy territory again and again, gathers intelligence at the risk of her life, convinces a group of highly educated white officers to take her advice, and guides the first major mission of black troops in American history to victory? How does she do it? Who is she? Well, another thing to know about Harriet Tubman is that she is a disabled person. We've often know of, and some of you might be, people who went into the American Army and came out disabled. So we talk about disabled vets. Harriet Tubman was disabled before she became a veteran. When she was a girl of about 12, she was hit in the head at this place, at this store, inside this store. She went into the store to get something she was asked to get by her mother. They were both enslaved on the same plantation. And there was a boy who'd run into the store, chased by an armed white man who was trying to capture this boy. And the boy, evades the man and starts to run out the door. And the man picks up this heavy weight, it's a heavy make weight, as they call, very heavy piece of iron. And he throws it at the boy. And Harriet Tubman jumps in front of the boy and gets hit in the head and extremely severely injured, almost dies, and develops what we think is probably temporal lobe epilepsy. In any case, some form of seizure disorder that she has until the end of her days. So she, like you, if you get real sleepy, could almost at any moment just lose consciousness. So here's a person who goes into the thick of the greatest danger, knowing that she can't actually rely on herself even. Think how hard that would be. Think how hard it would be to not know if the people who are counting on you for everything can't even trust. Now, some people have said, and we don't quite know why she was such a brave person, and some have said, maybe that injury, you know how traumatic brain injuries are, they affect personality. Maybe she couldn't actually feel fear in quite the degree you and I might feel fear. She also believed that she heard the voice of God, that God would tell her if she was in danger. She would ask God for advice. And she's a very pious woman, and that was also a very strong sentiment in all of America in the mid-19th century. So some people said, well, maybe it was that blow to the head that allowed her to be so fearless. If that's true, then why does she jump in front of the child to shield a child from an armed adult white male at age 12? It's because there's something that predates that injury that she uses despite that grievous injury. So she goes south, and one of the people she hooks up with there, she becomes a part of the team, is Thomas Wentworth Higginson, who, by the way, Emily Dickinson fans, you might remember somewhere in the back of your brain, he was the man who really discovers Emily Dickinson. Fantastic man of the 19th century. Anyway, he later at one point wrote to his mother, we've had the greatest heroine of the age here, Harriet Tubman. One of the things we know, and this is where our evidence comes in, is he says one of the things that he talks about Harriet in his memoirs, Harriet was here today, yeah, she came out with a mule, a team, and blah, blah, blah. He mentions that she interviews people who are coming off the islands. So the Sea Islands are kind of odd, beautiful, but kind of odd. I mean, there are times when the distance between the shore and the mainland, you almost can't tell where one stops and one starts. So there were slaves kind of, in a way, bleeding off the mainland, trying to get to freedom, which were these islands that were such a short distance away, but still very hard, and they're very well defended, very well armed. And by the way, I don't think I mentioned the alligators. So they're also alligator infested. So if you start to wade into that marsh, by the way, the other problem with the marsh is that they have what's called pluff mud, and the mud will come up to here, and it's like quicksand. You can't actually get out. Someone has to pull you out. So it's pretty well defended. Anyway, so Thomas Wentworth Higginson is one of the people she begins to work with. The other thing, one of the people who served with Wentworth Higginson, and he was a promoter of women's work, by the way. Not only did he promote Emily Dickinson's poems, but later in life he promoted the memoir of Susie King Taylor, who also gives us more evidence. Because some people have said, well, that picture of Harriet Tubman with the musket I showed you a little while ago, that's not really the right era musket of the Civil War. And what woman could have actually used a musket? And probably Harriet Tubman didn't use a musket. We don't know, and it doesn't say here in the military records she was issued a musket. But we do know from Susie King Taylor, who was genuinely a nurse, served entirely as a nurse, that they were issued muskets. And she said, I learned how to handle a musket very well while in the volunteers. Because you are in musket firing distance sometimes of people on that opposite shore. You can talk to them. That's how close the Sea Islands are to the mainland. So what Harriet Tubman does, and as Wentworth Higginson says, is that she talks to people as they come off the mainland, as they somehow find a way to escape and to get onto that shore. Because these people are not going to be interested in talking to a white person about what they know. And what they know is one of the most valuable things in any military conflict, which is what's happening on the ground. And it was Robert E. Lee who said the month before this raid, he said the chief's, he was writing to another officer, he said the chief, as we all know, the chief source of information to the enemy is through our Negroes. Because these were the people who knew where all the troops were, who knew exactly how they were provisioned, who generally knew what kind of firepower they had, who often knew what their plans were because they're sweeping the tents and baking the food and They are the chief source of intelligence. By the way, I want you to take note of his use of the word Negroes. For a person of the planter class, that was the typical way they referred to enslaved people, because they were too polite to say our slaves. These were men who talked about defending liberty. So they called them our Negroes. So when James Baldwin said, "I am not your Negro," there's several layers of meaning to that. So the source of information is going to be the people on shore. The question is, how do you get to the people on shore to collect the intelligence? You can't just rely on intelligence leaking off the coastline to you. So this is where it comes into the problem of actually developing intelligence. So getting on shore was deterred by a number of things, and one of them was this object here, which, I don't know, looks like some sort of pastry, possibly a croissant. But actually, this is what was known as a torpedo. I mentioned it earlier. That was the Civil War term for an underwater mine. And that was almost the only way that the South could defend this extraordinarily long coastline, because they didn't have a Navy. The Union really had the Navy. The South had a few ships that they got from England, basically. But they defended it largely through onshore cannons, riflemen, and these bombs, which were called torpedoes. So if you've ever heard the phrase, "Damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead," nod, please. You've heard that phrase, right? I used to always think that was like World War II something. That's Admiral Farragut at the Battle of Mobile Bay. And by the way, the ship ahead of him had just sunk, because you've got wooden ships hitting underwater bombs, and they go down in a matter of moments. So damn the torpedoes, I'm going through anyway. This is an actual a photograph of one, not just the drawing of it. So these are the wooden-hulled ships that are going upriver in these very slow-moving tidal kinds of rivers, and they're creeping up. And this is what they're going to see. They're going to see people working in the fields. And these are enslaved people in South Carolina. This is what the rice fields look like. That's what they were growing in this area, is largely rice, very wet, marshy conditions, very dangerous, by the way. Not only are there alligators, there are snakes and cottonmouths and all kinds of nasty bugs, etc. And this is how the fields were divided up. So on the morning of June 2nd, 1863, one Union gunship does get hung up on a sandbar. They have to leave it behind, put everybody on board 2 ships, and now they're going upriver on that morning I'm telling you about. They're going upriver, and this is the things they start to see, the slaves in the fields. And they get past the artillery because someone has found out that the South has just repositioned its heavy artillery, and they're no longer at the mouth of the Combahee. Someone just figured that out. Someone also just figured out that the new commander of those 10,000 troops camped, 2,000 troops camped 10 miles away, that he has kind of a reputation as a slacker, and he's new and he doesn't know the roads. Someone just found that out. And someone also found out, curiously, where these underwater mines are positioned. Now, these underwater mines have just foiled a month before one of the biggest assaults new assault on Fort Sumter, where one ship was sunk and others were heavily damaged because of the torpedoes and the cannons which were firing at them, etc. So someone found out somehow, the Union knew where these torpedoes were now. Now, by the way, a Blackwater River, you can put your hand on a Blackwater River. It's called that because of the sediment in the river. You can put your hand in and you won't see your fingertips. So these torpedoes are very, very well hidden, but somehow they knew where they were. And we know that they knew because the planters on shore, looking down from their beautiful homes, saw these ships edge around the torpedoes. Now, the planters knew where the torpedoes were because they had to get stuff up and down that river all the time. So they knew exactly where the torpedoes were. They knew that. But somebody coming freshly in a Union warship, flying the red, white, and blue, the symbol of freedom for those men and women on shore, those people wouldn't have known where they were unless somebody found out, unless some spy, some scout, some team of scouts got that intelligence. So by the way, I want to show you these 2 pictures just quickly, and I want to leave some time for questions. So I'm going to back this up if it allows me. Here we go. So you see, this is Harper's Weekly. This shows you this, the only scene we have of the attack. This is the ships. One of them was named the John Adams, quite fittingly, since this was a fight to see whether the land of George Washington would be forever split from the land of John Adams. But below that in Harpers Magazine is the most famous picture of American slavery. This man, you can see him below, and I hope you can see that. It's a very famous picture of American slavery because it shows a man, his back is bare, and he has this horrible pattern of scars. And this is a man who at the same time had just freshly crossed into Union lines. And on the left-hand side, it was one of the classic before and after pictures. On the left-hand side, it shows him in the raggedy clothing of a slave. On the right-hand side, it shows him in the proud uniform of the U.S. Army. And in the middle, it shows the damage that slavery has done. So this is what this raid was about. This raid was about bringing men offshore, recruiting soldiers for the Army, recruiting enslaved people so that they could become full Americans. So Tubman was under the command at this time of the leader of the 2nd South Carolina Volunteers, or 2 volunteer regiments, Thomas Wentworth Higginson and Montgomery. Montgomery later said Tubman was the most remarkable woman and invaluable as a scout. Now, by the way, she's not listed in the U.S. Army records as a scout. So all these generals talk about her value, how they sent her behind the lines, how she operated as a scout, but we have a hard time perceiving it and seeing it. And I think largely because she's a woman and because she's black, was black. Montgomery was chosen partly because he had been an associate of John Brown's, as was Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman was supposed to be at Harpers Ferry, did not go. We don't altogether know why. She said she was sick, and she may well have been. She was a person who had health problems. But he was selected partly because John Brown was this great symbol. Now, by the way, this is a very familiar picture of Harriet Tubman. If you've ever learned much about her, you might know this photograph. I do prefer this one because this is her at the time of the raid. This is when she was a much younger woman. I think that we tend to think of Harriet Tubman as a kind of old, middle-aged old woman, kind of chunky and gray-haired and all that. But she was also a very beautiful woman. I think it's wonderful that Cynthia Erivo, I hope you saw the movie if you didn't get it on Amazon. And she used this as a part of her spycraft. I think we have to understand Harriet Tubman in terms of spycraft. That's a term that the Central Intelligence Agency, which I've had some dealings with, not professionally, well, professionally as a historian, not as an agent. But spycraft is all about all the techniques you use to make sure that nobody notices you walking through the room, to make sure that nobody will ever actually record you, which makes it very hard historically later on. So Brigadier General Rufus Saxton, who was also, he was in charge of the contraband on Port Royal Island, he said Tubman was, quote, a spy who made many a raid inside the enemy's lines, displaying remarkable courage, zeal, and fidelity. At the end of the raid gets back. They do escape without a scratch, which is totally remarkable. As you do know, the more famous raid just shortly thereafter, half of the people die in casualties as a direct assault. Well, this was a direct assault, not on a fortified position, but it is remarkable that not a single soldier dies. And Harriet Tubman gives a great speech at the end. And sort of the last great piece of evidence for, was this Harriet Tubman, is that there was, I think there are a lot of circumstantial reasons. But the last reason, and I'll leave you with this, almost, because I'm a professor, therefore I have to add something more. There was a Wisconsin journalist, somebody who'd never met Harriet Tubman, did not know her name, did not know who she was. But he was there in an audience more or less like this, except 5 times the size. And he wrote back to Wisconsin, and it was then published in Boston newspapers and elsewhere. Colonel Montgomery and his gallant band of 300 black soldiers, under the guidance of a black woman, dashed into the enemy's country and struck a bold and effective blow without losing a man or receiving a scratch. The colonel's speech, because he spoke first, was followed by a speech from the black woman who led the raid, and under whose inspiration it was originated and conducted. For sound sense and real native eloquence, her address would do honor to any man, and it evoked quite a sensation. She is called Moses. So the last thing I'd like to do, now that I've just regaled you as a historian would do, come take my class at Texas A&M University, etc., I want to convince you I'm also a novelist too. So I'm going to go against convention slightly here, and I'm just going to read you the first paragraph of my novel so you'll understand that, why you'd want to walk in Harriet's shoes. By the way, she is a romantic heroine, because what historical novel is complete without a romance? And she was a very pretty woman. She was married twice. The first man who married her was a free man. And he chose this woman despite knowing that their children, his children, would be slaves. Because much of the world was patriarchal, but slavery was matrilineal. That's how you traced whether someone was a slave, because the woman who bore that child made that child a slave. Her second husband, so he chose her despite that. She must have been something. Her second husband was 20 years younger than her. And, anyway, I think that's pretty remarkable. So Harriet's eyes flew open at the cock's crow. Her mouth was dry, and her heart pounded. In the early morning light, she still sensed her husband's solid hip against hers, as if all she had to do to take him in her arms again was roll over. Instead, she pulled the sheet across her face. John Tubman was gone for good. Their marriage had been a sturdy one. John's timber business thrived in the 5 years they lived next to the plantation where Harriet grew up, rented to one sour-tempered mistress after another, until she was strong enough for field work outside slapping range. Her master, Edward Brodus, hadn't objected to the union. As she recalled, he even smiled when she asked his permission. If a free man wanted to waste his seed on a slave wife, Brodus was happy to reap the fruit. Free people of color like John Tubman often loved the wrong person. It was an easy mistake in a Maryland county where half the black population was enslaved and the other half was not. And John had been smitten ever since he spied Harriet felling a hickory all by herself. One tiny woman against the forest, he'd said, singing like an angel and swinging an axe like the devil. Thank you. Three minutes for questions. If you have any questions, please feel free. Or make a mad dash to the next exit. Yes, ma'am. So please, if you could be very quiet as you do leave, those of you who need to, go ahead. Okay, so the book, my spoiler friend over here says, has a great romance, thank you, about Harriet Tubman. What we know about that romance is very little. We know that this was a man under her command. We know he was enslaved. We believe that he escaped from the plantation. He did. The part that I imagine, and this is where historians start to get a little uncomfortable. I don't change a single fact, unlike Lin-Manuel Miranda. That's my previous novel. I don't change a single fact we do know, but I try to make up stuff that's plausible, historically logical in between that. I think she could have had fallen in love with someone that she was in command of. She'd been celibate for 11 years. She was, 40 years old. I think it's entirely possible. And she did marry again, so I am making a lot of it up. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am. Cool, quiet, yeah. So the questions about the film. What did I think about the film Harriet? Who here has seen it? Some people have seen it. Fantastic. Now go double that number, please. So the film, I think, is beautiful. I think Cynthia Erivo was a fantastic choice. Harriet Tubman was known for having a beautiful singing voice, like Tara Westover, whom we got to hear, thanks to Coyle yesterday, sing a hymn for us. And Harriet Tubman had a fabulous voice, so I think, and Erivo is very pretty. I think she's a perfect choice, and she did a fantastic job. Let's vote for her for the Best Actress. I'm hoping she gets that. My difference with the film is I think the film, just from a historical point of view, it emphasized her bravery and her persistence and her courage. Some people say, what woman could do that? And I say to myself, what woman wouldn't do that? She went back for her family. What woman turns her back, walks away from her mother, knowing that her three older sisters have been sold, knowing she has a younger sister who will be sold? What woman doesn't go back if she can? I realize, by the way, most don't. But what woman wouldn't want to? So I think Erivo does a fantastic job of showing that. But I don't think it does any justice whatsoever, virtually, to her spycraft. She's a very smart woman. It's not just that God told her to turn left instead of right. Really, and honestly, I think if it had been a man we were talking about his great heroic military exploits, we might not say, well, it's because God told him how to do it, you know. So I think that we do emphasize a little too much her spirituality there. All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much. Thank you.